Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see coming. It's the one you never saw at all. In the world of elite military operations, respect isn't given freely. It's earned through blood, sweat, and proving yourself when everything is on the line. But what happens when someone mistakes a legend for a liability? What happens when arrogance meets experience, and the truth comes crashing down like a sledgehammer? This is the story of Master Chief Sarah Phoenix Martinez, a woman whose 25 years in the Navy SEALs remained hidden behind a quiet exterior and a preference for letting her actions speak louder than her words. It's also the story of Staff Sergeant Marcus "Bulldog" Thompson, a decorated Marine whose pride would nearly cost him everything he thought he knew about strength, courage, and what it really means to be a warrior. Their paths crossed on a scorching Tuesday morning at Joint Base Pearl Harbor during what was supposed to be a routine inter-service training exercise. Neither knew that by sunset, one would be fighting for their career, and the other would be questioning everything they believed about themselves and the brotherhood they'd sworn to protect. The morning air hung thick with humidity as Sarah Martinez stepped out of her rental car in the parking lot of Joint Base Pearl Harbor. At 47 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from 2.5 decades of serving in the most elite fighting force in the world. Her graying hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her civilian clothes gave no hint of the extraordinary career that lay beneath the surface. Sarah had retired from active duty 6 months earlier, but the Navy had called her back for a special assignment. The SEALs were implementing a new close-quarters combat training program, and they needed someone with her unique expertise to oversee the initial phases. Few people knew the full extent of her service record, and that's exactly how she preferred it. As she walked toward the training facility, Sarah's mind drifted to her early days in the teams. She'd been one of the first women to successfully complete SEAL training when the program opened to female candidates. The path hadn't been easy. Every day had been a battle, not just against the physical demands of the program, but against the skepticism of instructors and fellow candidates who questioned whether a woman belonged in their ranks. But Sarah had proved herself time and again. Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan, where she'd spent 18 months hunting high-value targets in the mountains along the Pakistan border. She'd earned her nickname Phoenix during a mission gone wrong near Kandahar, when her team was ambushed, and she'd single-handedly held off enemy fighters for 3 hours until extraction arrived. Rising from what should have been certain death, she'd emerged stronger than ever. The years that followed had taken her to every corner of the globe: Somalia, Iraq, Syria, the Philippines, and a dozen other places that didn't officially exist on any mission reports. She'd led teams, trained foreign fighters, and completed operations that would never see the light of day in any history book. Along the way, she'd earned every medal the Navy could offer, including 2 Silver Stars and a Navy Cross. But today, walking across the hot asphalt toward a building full of Marines and Navy personnel who had no idea who she was, Sarah felt the familiar weight of having to prove herself all over again. Inside the training facility, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson was putting his Marines through their morning conditioning routine. At 32 years old, Marcus was everything the Marine Corps wanted in a non-commissioned officer. 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and determination, with a square jaw and the kind of confidence that came from leading men in combat. Marcus had enlisted right out of high school in small-town Alabama, driven by a desire to serve his country and prove he was tougher than anyone thought possible. He'd excelled in boot camp, fought his way through multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and earned his stripes by being the Marine that other Marines looked to when things got tough. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Bulldog Thompson was known for never backing down from a fight, never accepting anything less than perfection from his Marines, and never suffering fools gladly. He believed in the old-school values of the Corps: honor, courage, commitment, and the unshakable conviction that Marines were the finest fighting force on earth. Marcus also believed, though he'd never admit it publicly, that certain traditions should remain unchanged. In his mind, combat was a man's business, and while he respected the contributions women made to the military in support roles, he had serious doubts about their place in direct combat operations. He'd seen too many situations where physical strength was the difference between life and death, and, in his experience, that usually favored men. As he counted out push-ups for his Marines, Marcus noticed a woman in civilian clothes walking through the facility. She was older, maybe late 40s, with a quiet way of moving that seemed out of place among the controlled chaos of morning PT. He watched as she approached one of the Navy instructors and began what appeared to be a serious conversation. "Wonder what that's about," muttered Corporal Jenkins, one of Marcus's most reliable Marines, as he noticed his sergeant's distracted gaze. "Probably some contractor here to teach us about sensitivity training or something," Marcus replied with a grunt of disgust. "Pentagon's always sending people to tell us how to do our jobs." What Marcus didn't know was that the contractor was actually there to teach him things he'd never learned in all his years of Marine training. Things about humility, respect, and the dangerous assumptions that could destroy a career in a single moment. After her brief check-in with the Navy coordinator, Sarah made her way to the main training floor, where she'd been told to observe the current training methods before implementing her new program. The facility was impressive, with state-of-the-art equipment and enough space to run multiple training scenarios simultaneously. She found a position along one wall where she could watch without interfering, pulling out a small notebook to document her observations. The Marines were running through close-quarters battle drills, and she could see immediately that while their enthusiasm was high, their techniques needed significant refinement. Sarah had spent years developing and perfecting the training methods she'd been brought in to implement. Her approach focused on mental preparation as much as physical skill, understanding that the most dangerous opponent was often the one who could think faster and adapt quicker, not necessarily the one who could bench press the most weight. As she watched the Marines work through their drills, Sarah began to see patterns in their mistakes. They were relying too heavily on brute force and not enough on tactical thinking. Their movements were predictable, and their formations showed gaps that a well-trained enemy could exploit. In her notebook, she began sketching out modifications to the training program that could address these issues. Marcus, meanwhile, had noticed the woman taking notes and felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. Here was someone who had probably never been in a real firefight, never felt the weight of responsibility for other people's lives, presuming to evaluate his Marines. He'd dealt with this kind of thing before, and it never ended well. "Jenkins," he called to his corporal, "take the squad through the next rotation. I'll be right back." Marcus approached Sarah with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to confronting problems head-on. He'd done this dance before with Pentagon officials and civilian contractors who thought they understood military operations from their air-conditioned offices. In his experience, the best way to deal with these situations was to establish dominance early and make it clear that his Marines weren't going to be guinea pigs for someone's untested theories. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said as he approached, his voice carrying the tone of barely contained authority. "I'm Staff Sergeant Thompson. I couldn't help but notice you taking notes on my Marines training. Might I ask what your interest is in our operations?" Sarah looked up from her notebook, taking in the muscled Marine standing before her with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a challenging expression. She'd encountered this type many times before, especially in her early career. The response was almost always the same: establish credentials quietly, defuse the situation, and get on with the work. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant," Sarah replied calmly. "I am Sara Martinez. I'm here to observe your current training methods as part of implementing a new close-quarters combat program." "I see," Marcus said, his tone making it clear that he didn't see anything positive about the situation. "And what exactly qualifies you to evaluate Marine training procedures? Have you served in a combat role yourself?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. Marcus was betting that, like most civilian contractors and Pentagon consultants, Sarah's military experience would be limited to desk jobs and theoretical knowledge. He was prepared to politely but firmly establish that his Marines didn't need advice from someone who'd never been under fire. Sarah could have ended the conversation right there by mentioning her rank or her service record. 25 years in the SEALs spoke for itself, and even the most stubborn Marine would have to acknowledge that level of experience. But something in Marcus's tone triggered a memory of every time she'd been dismissed, underestimated, or challenged simply because of her gender. Instead of revealing her credentials, Sarah decided to let the situation play out. Sometimes the best way to teach a lesson was to let someone walk themselves into it. "I have some experience in combat operations," she said simply, her voice remaining neutral. "I think you'll find that the training program I'm implementing will benefit your Marines significantly." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The non-answer confirmed everything he'd suspected. This was another bureaucrat with a college degree and no real-world experience coming to tell warriors how to do their jobs. The fact that she was a woman only reinforced his belief that she had no business evaluating combat training. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Marcus said, his tone indicating that very little respect was actually being offered, "my Marines have been through multiple combat deployments. They've proved themselves under fire in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not sure what kind of theoretical improvements you think you can offer to men who've actually been in the fight." Several of Marcus's Marines had noticed the conversation and were beginning to drift closer, curious about what was developing between their sergeant and the unknown woman. Sarah was aware of the growing audience, but remained focused on Marcus, recognizing that this moment was about much more than just a training program. "I appreciate your concern for your Marines, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice still calm, but carrying a subtle edge that Marcus was too focused on his own grievances to notice. "But I think you might be surprised by what they could learn from some new perspectives." "New perspectives," Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Ma'am, let me explain something to you. These Marines have been in situations where one mistake means people die. They've carried wounded comrades out of kill zones, cleared buildings where every shadow could hide an enemy, and made split-second decisions that determined whether they went home alive or in a box." He gestured toward his squad, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his subject. "You want to talk about perspectives? The perspective these men have is earned in blood and sweat. It's not something you get from reading reports or attending seminars. It comes from being there when everything goes wrong and finding a way to complete the mission anyway." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words carefully. In truth, she was thinking about a night in Mosul when her SEAL team had been trapped in a building for 14 hours while enemy fighters tried to smoke them out with grenades and automatic weapons fire. She was remembering the weight of a wounded teammate as she'd carried him across 300 meters of open ground under heavy fire. She was recalling the dozens of times she'd been exactly where Marcus described his Marines had been, except with the added challenge of proving she belonged there every single day. "You make an interesting point about blood and sweat, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said quietly. "Tell me, what do you think qualifies someone to train elite fighters? What kind of experience would you respect?" Marcus sensed that he was being led somewhere, but his irritation had grown to the point where caution was no longer governing his responses. He'd dealt with too many know-it-all civilians who thought they understood military operations, and he was determined to make his position clear. "Real combat experience," he said firmly. "Leading men under fire, making life and death decisions when there's no backup plan and no safety net. Proving that you can do whatever it takes to bring your people home alive." His voice was gaining strength as more Marines gathered to listen. "That's what I respect. Not some civilian contractor who thinks she can waltz in here and improve on training that's kept Marines alive in the worst places on Earth." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the familiar fire that had driven her through SEAL training, through countless deployments, and through every moment when someone had told her she didn't belong. But this time, instead of fighting to prove herself, she had the luxury of letting Marcus prove himself wrong. "That's a fair standard, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note that made several of the more experienced Marines shift uncomfortably, though they couldn't quite identify why. "I appreciate you being so clear about your expectations." Marcus felt a moment of uncertainty as he looked into Sarah's eyes. There was something there he hadn't noticed before, a kind of calm confidence that seemed out of place in a civilian contractor. But he'd already committed to his position, and backing down now would undermine his authority with his Marines. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to be disrespectful," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just looking out for my Marines. They deserve trainers who understand what they're going through, who've been where they've been. I hope you can understand that." Understand perfectly, Staff Sergeant, Sarah replied. In fact, I respect your loyalty to your Marines. That's exactly the kind of leadership that makes the difference in combat. The compliment seemed to catch Marcus off guard, and for a moment his aggressive posture softened slightly. But the damage was already done, and the conversation had attracted the attention of other personnel throughout the training facility. What had started as a private exchange was now becoming a public confrontation. Corporal Jenkins, who had been watching the conversation from a distance, approached cautiously. He'd served under Marcus for 2 years and knew his sergeant's moods better than most. Something about this situation felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. "Sergeant," Jenkins said quietly, "maybe we should get back to training. The commander wanted us to finish the urban warfare scenario before 1100. Marcus nodded, but didn't break eye contact with Sarah. "You're right, Corporal. We've got work to do." He turned back to Sarah one final time. "Ma'am, I'm sure you understand that we've got a schedule to maintain. If you need to observe our training, you're welcome to do so from a distance. But I'd appreciate it if you'd let us do our jobs without interference." It was a dismissal, plain and simple, delivered with enough politeness to avoid a direct confrontation, but with enough edge to make the message clear. Sarah nodded calmly, but several of the Marines noticed that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Staff Sergeant. I'll observe from here while you continue your training." She paused for just a moment, then added, "I'm looking forward to seeing how your Marines perform under pressure." As Marcus turned to rejoin his squad, Sarah made a mental note to herself. The training program she'd been brought in to implement was designed to break down exactly the kind of arrogant assumptions she'd just witnessed. But first, she needed to understand how deep those assumptions ran and whether they were shared by the Marines under Marcus's command. The next few hours would be very educational for everyone involved. Marcus rejoined his Marines with a sense of satisfaction, feeling that he'd successfully established boundaries with another meddling civilian. His squad looked to him for guidance, and he could see respect in their eyes for the way he'd stood up to outside interference. "All right, Marines," he called out, his voice carrying across the training floor. "Let's show our observer what real combat training looks like." Jenkins set up the urban warfare scenario. "I want perfect execution." As his Marines moved to prepare for the next training exercise, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he glanced toward the wall where Sarah was standing, she was there with her notebook, quietly observing and taking notes. There was something about her presence that made him feel like he was being evaluated in a way that went beyond simple observation. But Marcus Thompson had never been one to back down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. If this civilian consultant wanted to see what Marines were capable of, he'd make sure she got a demonstration she'd never forget. What he didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had already learned everything she needed to know about Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson. The real education was about to begin, and the lesson would be one that neither of them would ever forget. The urban warfare scenario that Marcus had designed for his Marines was intended to showcase everything they'd learned about close-quarters combat in real-world situations. The training facility had been configured to simulate a Middle Eastern village, complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and civilians represented by mannequins placed throughout the area. Marcus positioned himself at the observation deck, where he could oversee the exercise while providing commentary for Sarah's benefit. He was confident that watching his Marines in action would demonstrate the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. "Ma'am," he said as Sarah approached the observation area with her notebook, "this scenario is based on actual operations my Marines have conducted in Fallujah and Ramadi. You'll see techniques that have been proven under fire, not just in training environments." Sarah nodded thoughtfully as she settled into a position where she could observe both the exercise below and Marcus's reactions. "I'm very interested to see how they perform," she said. "Real-world experience is invaluable." The first team of Marines moved into the simulated village with textbook precision, their rifles at the ready as they advanced through the initial checkpoint. Marcus watched with obvious pride as his men demonstrated the fundamentals of urban warfare: proper spacing, effective communication, and systematic clearing procedures. "See how they maintain overlapping fields of fire," Marcus explained, his voice taking on the tone of an instructor. That's something you can't learn from manual. It takes months of training and real experience to develop that kind of coordination. As the exercise progressed, however, Sarah began to notice the same patterns she'd observed during the earlier training. The Marines were competent and well-drilled, but their tactics were predictable and overly reliant on established procedures. They moved through the scenario like they were following a checklist rather than adapting to dynamic circumstances. "Staff Sergeant," Sarah said quietly, "what would your Marines do if the enemy didn't follow the expected pattern? If they encountered resistance from an unexpected direction?" Marcus glanced at her with mild irritation. "Ma'am, these Marines have been in actual combat. They know how to adapt to changing circumstances. The scenarios we're running are based on real operations that succeeded." "I'm sure they are," Sarah replied. "But have you considered that your enemies might also learn from those same operations? That they might adapt their tactics based on studying how American forces respond to specific situations?" The question struck closer to home than Marcus wanted to admit. During his last deployment to Afghanistan, his unit had encountered increasingly sophisticated enemy tactics that seemed designed to exploit standard Marine procedures. But acknowledging that would mean admitting that their training might need significant updates. "Our tactics work because they're based on proven principles," Marcus said firmly. "Fire and maneuver, mutual support, overwhelming firepower. These aren't just theories, they're the foundation of everything we do." Below them, the first team had successfully cleared the initial building and was moving toward their second objective. But Sarah had noticed something that Marcus had missed. The team leader was telegraphing his intentions through body language and radio chatter that would have been easily intercepted by a real enemy. What if the opposition was listening to their communications? Sarah asked. What if they could predict the team's next move based on their movement patterns? Marcus felt his patience beginning to wear thin. "Ma'am, our communications are encrypted and our Marines are trained to use proper radio discipline. What you're describing might happen with inexperienced troops, but these are combat veterans." "Of course," Sarah said mildly. "I'm just curious about contingency planning. In my experience, the enemy often does things we don't expect." The phrase, "in my experience," caught Marcus's attention, and he turned to look at Sarah more carefully. There was something in the way she'd said it that suggested more than theoretical knowledge, but he dismissed the thought. If she'd had real military experience, surely she would have mentioned it by now. The exercise continued with the Marines systematically clearing each building in the simulated village. Their technique was solid, and their execution was professional, but Sarah could see that they were following a rigid pattern that would be easily exploited by an adaptive enemy. As the Marines approached the final objective, Sarah noticed that they were making a critical tactical error. They were concentrating their force in a way that left them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers, and their communication patterns had become predictable enough that an experienced opponent could anticipate their next moves. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, "what do you see happening with the team's positioning right now?" Marcus looked down at his Marines with pride. They were executing a textbook assault on the final building, using proper cover and maintaining good fire discipline. "I see Marines doing exactly what they should be doing," he said. "Aggressive assault with proper support. And if there were enemy forces in the building to the left, the one they bypassed because it wasn't part of their assigned route." Marcus felt a flicker of annoyance. "Ma'am, the scenario doesn't include enemy forces in that building. The Marines are following their assigned objectives." "But what if it did?" Sarah pressed gently. "What if the enemy had moved into that position after the initial reconnaissance? What if they were preparing to attack your Marines from their blind side?" The question hung in the air as the exercise below reached its climax. The Marines successfully breached the final building and secured their objective, but Sarah's question had planted a seed of doubt in Marcus's mind. In real combat, there was no guarantee that enemies would stay where they were supposed to be. As the Marines regrouped and prepared for the after-action review, Marcus found himself looking at the exercise with new eyes. The building Sarah had mentioned would indeed provide perfect cover for an enemy force, and his Marines had completely ignored it because it wasn't part of their planned route. "The scenario is designed to test specific skills," Marcus said but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. In a real operation, we'd have additional intelligence and support assets. Of course, Sarah agreed. But what happens when the intelligence is wrong? Or when support assets aren't available? What happens when your Marines have to rely solely on their training and their ability to think on their feet? The questions were beginning to irritate Marcus because they were touching on concerns he'd harbored since his last deployment. The enemy they'd faced in Afghanistan had shown an uncomfortable ability to adapt and innovate, while American forces sometimes seemed locked into rigid procedures that became predictable over time. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that a civilian contractor might have valid insights about military operations, and that was a concession Marcus wasn't prepared to make. "Ma'am," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I appreciate your interest in our training, but I think you're overcomplicating things. Combat isn't about theoretical scenarios and what-if questions. It's about executing proven tactics with precision and aggression. My Marines have done that in real combat situations, and they just demonstrated it here." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, but Marcus could see that she wasn't convinced. There was something in her expression that suggested she was seeing things he was missing, and that realization only added to his growing frustration. "I understand your position, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said. "Perhaps you'd be interested in a small demonstration? Something that might illustrate some of the points I've been trying to make?" Marcus felt his back stiffen. The suggestion seemed innocent enough, but there was something in Sarah's tone that set off alarm bells. Still, backing down from a challenge wasn't in his nature, and he'd already established his position in front of his Marines. "What kind of demonstration?" he asked cautiously. "Well," Sarah said, "you mentioned that combat is about executing proven tactics with precision and aggression. Why don't we test that principle? You could run your Marines through another scenario, but this time with an opposition force that isn't bound by the same predictable patterns." Marcus felt the trap closing around him, but he couldn't see a way to decline without losing face. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A simple exercise," Sarah said. "Your Marines against a single opponent using unconventional tactics. Winner take all. If your Marines succeed, I'll recommend that the new training program incorporate more traditional methods. If they don't, perhaps you'll be more open to some alternative approaches." The challenge was issued so quietly and politely that it took Marcus a moment to realize what had just happened. He'd been maneuvered into a position where his authority and his Marine's reputation were on the line against a civilian contractor who thought she could outfight trained combat veterans. "Ma'am," Marcus said slowly, "are you suggesting that you personally could defeat a team of combat-experienced Marines in a training exercise?" "I'm suggesting that training should prepare warriors for unexpected situations," Sarah replied. "And sometimes the best way to learn is through direct experience." Several of Marcus's Marines had overheard the conversation and were beginning to gather around the observation deck. Word was spreading quickly through the facility that some kind of challenge was being issued, and the atmosphere was becoming charged with anticipation. Corporal Jenkins approached cautiously, sensing the tension between his sergeant and the unknown woman. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "what's the situation?" Marcus looked at his Marines, then back at Sarah. He'd built his reputation on never backing down from challenge, and his Marines were watching to see how he'd respond. But something about this situation felt wrong, though he couldn't identify exactly what it was. "This civilian consultant thinks she can teach Marines about combat," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly to the assembled troops. "She's proposing some kind of training exercise to demonstrate her methods." A murmur went through the gathered Marines. The idea that a middle-aged civilian woman could challenge their combat effectiveness seemed absurd, but the situation had developed enough momentum that it couldn't be easily dismissed. "What are the rules?" asked Staff Sergeant Williams, a senior NCO who had been observing from nearby. Williams was known for his level head and tactical expertise, and Marcus respected his judgment. Sarah looked at the assembled Marines calmly. "Simple force-on-force exercise using training weapons. Your Marines get to choose the scenario and the objectives. They can use any tactics they want, while I'll try to prevent them from completing their mission." "Just you?" Williams asked skeptically. "Against how many Marines?" Staff Sergeant Thompson can decide, Sarah said. Whatever he thinks is appropriate. Marcus felt the weight of expectation from his Marines. They were looking at him to make a decision that would either validate their training and experience or potentially expose them to ridicule. But the alternative was to refuse a challenge from a civilian, which would be almost as damaging to their reputation. For Marines, Marcus said finally, standard fire team, training weapons only, safety protocols in effect. Scenario, assault, and secure a building against defending force. Agreed, Sarah said simply. When would you like to conduct the exercise? Right now, Marcus replied, his frustration finally overcoming his caution. Let's settle this once and for all. As the word spread through the training facility, personnel began gathering to witness what was being called the most unusual challenge in Joint Base Pearl Harbor history. Navy SEALs, Marines, and support staff found reasons to be in the area as Marcus selected his 4 best Marines for the exercise. The team he chose represented the cream of his unit. Corporal Jenkins, his most reliable squad leader. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, a former reconnaissance Marine with exceptional marksmanship skills. Private First Class Washington, an urban warfare specialist. And Lance Corporal Thompson, no relation, a communications expert who'd served 3 combat tours. As the Marines prepared their equipment and reviewed the scenario, Sarah Martinez quietly checked her own gear. The training weapons were fitted with sensors that would register hits, and the facility's computer system would track the exercise in real time. Marcus briefed his team with confidence, outlining a straightforward assault plan that had worked successfully in Iraq. The building they'd chosen was 3 stories with multiple entry points, and he was certain that 4 experienced Marines could overwhelm a single defender regardless of her theoretical knowledge. Remember, Marcus told his team, this is about more than just this exercise. Every Marine in this facility is watching to see how we handle some civilian who thinks she knows better than we do. I want textbook execution and overwhelming force. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 30 minutes studying the building's layout and identifying defensive positions that weren't obvious from the outside. More importantly, she'd recognized the assault plan Marcus would likely choose based on his earlier training exercises, and she was already preparing countermeasures. As the exercise began, Marcus positioned himself in the observation room with a clear view of the entire building. He was confident that his Marines would complete the mission quickly and decisively, finally, putting an end to this civilian's presumptuous challenges. But as he watched Sarah Martinez disappear into the building like a shadow, moving with a fluidity and purpose that seemed completely at odds with her earlier mild-mannered demeanor, Marcus felt the first stirrings of genuine uncertainty. The exercise was about to begin, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The building chosen for the exercise was a 3-story concrete structure designed to simulate the kind of urban environment American forces had encountered throughout the Middle East. It featured multiple entry points, stairwells at both ends, numerous rooms that could conceal defenders, and a flat roof that provided both observation points and potential escape routes. Marcus had positioned himself in the main observation center where banks of monitors displayed feeds from cameras throughout the building. The facility's training staff had activated the full sensor system, which would track every movement and register every simulated hit with electronic precision. What had started as an impromptu challenge was now being documented with the same thoroughness as any official military exercise. Contact Sports Control, this is observation, came the voice of the exercise controller through Marcus's headset. All systems are green. Participants are in position. Exercise will commence on your mark. Through his headset, Marcus could hear the communications between his 4 Marines as they approached the building. Their voices were calm and professional, displaying the confidence that came from years of training and multiple combat deployments. He'd chosen his best people for this mission, and he was certain they'd demonstrate the superiority of traditional Marine tactics. Bulldog Base, this is Bulldog 1, came Corporal Jenkins's voice. Target building in sight. No visible activity. Request permission to begin approach. Bulldog 1, you are cleared to commence mission, Marcus replied. Remember, this is about proving a point. I want clean, aggressive execution. As his Marines began their approach, Marcus scanned the monitor feeds, trying to locate Sarah. For several minutes, the cameras showed empty rooms and corridors. Then, suddenly, there was a flicker of movement on the third floor, so brief that Marcus almost missed it. "Where is she?" he muttered to himself, leaning closer to the monitors. Staff Sergeant Williams had joined Marcus in the observation center, along with several other senior NCOs who'd heard about the unusual challenge. The room was filling with spectators as word spread throughout the base about the exercise in progress. "Your Marines are looking good," Williams commented as he watched the four-man team establish a perimeter around the building. "Textbook approach. Whoever this woman is, she's picked a fight with the wrong unit." Marcus nodded, but he was still troubled by his inability to locate Sarah on the monitors. The building was extensively covered by surveillance cameras, but somehow she seemed to have found the blind spots. That suggested a level of tactical awareness that went beyond what he'd expect from a civilian contractor. "Bulldog Base, this is Bulldog 1, Jenkins reported. "Perimeter established. Beginning reconnaissance of entry points. No contact with opposing force." Through the monitor feeds, Marcus watched his Marines systematically examine each potential entrance to the building. Their movements were precise and coordinated, with each Marine maintaining awareness of his teammates' positions while covering potential threat areas. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, positioned as Overwatch, had found an elevated position that provided clear fields of fire on two sides of the building. "Bulldog 1, this is Bulldog 4. Overwatch in position. I have good observation on primary entry points. Still no visual on the target. Copy, Bulldog 4. Maintain Overwatch." Jenkins moved his team toward the main entrance, which offered the most direct route to the building's interior. "Bulldog Base, we're moving to primary entry point. Request permission to breach." Marcus felt a surge of confidence as he watched his Marines prepare for entry. This was exactly the kind of operation they conducted dozens of times in Iraq and Afghanistan, and their execution was flawless. Whatever theoretical knowledge Sarah might possess, it couldn't match the real-world experience his team brought to the fight. "Bulldog 1, you are clear to breach," and "Clear," Marcus authorized. The entry was perfect. Private First Class Washington placed a simulated breaching charge on the door while the rest of the team prepared for immediate entry. The electronic system registered the breach, and the Marines flowed into the building with practiced efficiency. "Bulldog Base, we're inside," Jenkins reported. "Beginning systematic clearance. First floor appears empty, but we're taking nothing for granted." Marcus watched the monitor feeds as his Marines cleared each room on the ground floor. Their techniques were exactly what he'd expect from experienced urban fighters: quick, aggressive, and thorough. Each room was cleared systematically, with proper coverage and communication. But as the minutes passed with no contact, Marcus began to feel uneasy. Sarah had to be somewhere in the building, but there was still no sign of her on any of the camera feeds. It was as if she'd simply vanished. "Movement," Rodriguez suddenly reported from his Overwatch position. "Third floor, northeast window. Brief silhouette gone now. Copy, Bulldog 4. She's on the third floor." Jenkins immediately began directing his team toward the stairwell. "Bulldog 2, Bulldog 3, move to stairs. We're going up." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, finally feeling that the exercise was about to reach its conclusion. With Sarah's position identified, his Marines could concentrate their force and end the demonstration quickly. But as he watched the feeds from the third floor, he noticed something that made his breath catch. One of the cameras showed a corridor that should have been empty, but there was something wrong with the shadows. It took Marcus several seconds to realize what he was seeing. Sarah had positioned herself in a corner where the camera's angle created a blind spot, but she was clearly visible to anyone approaching from the stairwell. "Jenkins, she's in position to ambush you at the top of the stairs," Marcus said urgently into his radio. "Copy, Bulldog Base. We're taking precautions." But even as Jenkins acknowledged the warning, Marcus realized that Sarah had already moved. The shadows in the corridor had shifted, and she was no longer where she'd been just seconds before. Somehow, she'd anticipated that the camera feeds would reveal her position and had relocated before the Marines could respond. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah knew about the cameras. She understood the facility's surveillance system well enough to use it against his Marines, revealing herself just long enough to draw them into a specific area before disappearing again. Bulldog 1, be advised, target has moved. I repeat, target has relocated from previous position. Understood, Bulldog Base. We're proceeding with caution. As Marcus watched his Marines cautiously advance up the stairwell, he began to notice other details that hadn't registered before. Sarah's earlier movements, though brief, had been extraordinarily fluid and purposeful. She wasn't just hiding in the building. She was controlling the flow of the engagement, drawing his Marines exactly where she wanted them. This doesn't make sense, he muttered to Williams. She's moving like she's done this before. Maybe she has, Williams replied thoughtfully. You said she's a civilian contractor, but did you actually verify that? There's something about the way she's handling the situation that suggests more than theoretical knowledge. Marcus felt a cold realization beginning to form in his mind, but he pushed it aside. There was no way a civilian consultant could outmaneuver 4 combat-experienced Marines. Whatever was happening, his team would adapt and complete the mission. Bulldog Base, this is Bulldog 1. We're at the second floor landing. No contact yet, but I'm getting a bad feeling about this. Through the cameras, Marcus could see his Marines grouped at the base of the final stairwell leading to the 3rd floor. Their formation was tactically sound, but something about their positioning bothered him. They were bunched together in a way that would make them vulnerable to the first contact. Alarm sounded exactly as Marcus realized what was about to happen. A camera feed from the 2nd floor showed a small object rolling down the corridor toward his Marine's position. It was a training grenade, and it had been thrown from a position that shouldn't have been accessible to Sarah. Grenade! Jenkins shouted, and his team immediately took cover in nearby doorways. The electronic system registered the simulated explosion and calculated its effects. According to the sensors, all 4 Marines would have been wounded, though none killed. How'd you get behind us? Washington demanded over the radio. We cleared that entire floor. Marcus stared at the monitors in disbelief. The camera feeds clearly showed that the 2nd floor had been empty when his Marines passed through it. But somehow, Sarah had managed to get into position behind them without being detected. Bulldog Base, we need to reassess, Jenkins reported, his voice tight with frustration. Target somehow flanked our position. Recommend we fall back and regroup. Negative, Bulldog 1. Press the attack. She's just one person, and you got her trapped on the upper floors. But even as Marcus gave the order, he was beginning to suspect that Sarah Martinez was far from trapped. She was doing something that professional soldiers were specifically trained to do. She was controlling the engagement, dictating the tempo of the fight, and making her opponents react to her initiatives rather than executing their own plan. The Marines regrouped and began their advance toward the 3rd floor with renewed caution. But Marcus could see that their earlier confidence had been shaken. They were moving more slowly now, checking corners that they'd previously trusted, second-guessing decisions that had seemed obvious minutes before. Bulldog 4, this is Bulldog 1. Do you still have Overwatch on the building exterior? Affirmative, Bulldog 1. All exit points covered. Target is still inside. Copy. Beginning 3rd floor clearance. As his Marines approached the final level, Marcus found himself studying Sarah's tactics with grudging professional respect. She'd used the building's layout and surveillance system to her advantage, struck when his Marines were most vulnerable, and then disappeared again before they could respond effectively. But what troubled Marcus most was the growing realization that everything Sarah had done so far demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that went far beyond theoretical knowledge. She was fighting like someone who'd been trained by the best and tested under fire. Movement, southeast corner room. Rodriguez reported from Overwatch. Brief muzzle flash. Target is engaging. The second contact alarm sounded as the training system registered another simulated engagement. This time, Lance Corporal Thompson had been hit while advancing down a corridor that had appeared to be clear. Bulldog 3 is down, Jenkins reported grimly. Target is using hit-in, run tactics, striking from concealed positions. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he watched his Marines' systematic advance being turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Sarah was picking them off one by one, using superior positioning and tactical awareness to negate their numerical advantage. Bulldog 1, consolidate your remaining team and finish this mission, Marcus ordered, his voice betraying more frustration than he'd intended. But as he watched the remaining Marines try to corner their elusive opponent, Marcus was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a training exercise anymore. It was a lesson in humility being delivered by someone who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. The question that was beginning to haunt him was simple. Who exactly was Sarah Martinez? And what had he gotten his Marines into? The answer would come soon enough, but by then, it would be too late to take back the assumptions that had led them all to this moment. The third contact alarm sent a chill through the observation room that had nothing to do with the facility's air conditioning. On the monitors, Marcus watched Private First Class Washington take cover behind an overturned table as the training system registered another hit from an opponent who seemed to materialize from nowhere. Bulldog 2 is down, Jenkins reported, his voice now carrying a note of genuine concern. Target is using advanced infiltration techniques. She's not fighting like any civilian I've ever encountered. Marcus gripped the edge of the control panel as the reality of the situation began to sink in. 3 of his 4 Marines had been eliminated by a single opponent who was demonstrating tactical skills that exceeded anything he'd expected from a Pentagon consultant. The methodical way Sarah was dismantling his team suggested professional military training of the highest caliber. Staff Sergeant Williams leaned closer to Marcus and spoke quietly. Thompson, I think we need to consider that your civilian contractor might not be as civilian as we thought. Bulldog Base, this is Bulldog 1. Jenkins's voice crackled through the speakers. I'm down myself, and Bulldog 4 on Overwatch. Target has demonstrated knowledge of advanced combat techniques. Request guidance. Marcus stared at the monitors, watching his most experienced corporal take cover in a third-floor room while trying to locate an opponent who seemed to move through the building like smoke. Everything about Sarah's tactics screamed professional military training, but that would mean she deliberately misled him about her background. Bulldog 1, complete the mission, Marcus ordered, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. You're still Marines. Adapt and overcome. As Jenkins began moving toward what he believed was Sarah's last known position, Marcus found himself replaying every interaction he'd had with her. The calm way she'd accepted his challenges, the pointed questions about combat experience, the casual mention of being under fire, details that had seemed like typical consultant jargon now took on an entirely different meaning. The fourth contact alarm was almost anticlimactic. The monitors showed Jenkins turning a corner into what appeared to be an empty room, only to find himself face-to-face with Sarah Martinez positioned in a spot that provided perfect cover while leaving him completely exposed. Exercise terminate. Exercise terminate, came the voice of the controller. All opposing forces have been eliminated. Defending force maintains control of objective. The training facility fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. On the monitors, Sarah emerged from her concealed position and began checking on the wounded Marines, her demeanor calm and professional. There was no hint of triumph in her movements, no celebration of victory. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had expected exactly this outcome. Marcus stood frozen in the observation room, surrounded by a dozen senior NCOs and officers who had witnessed his Marines being systematically outmaneuvered by a single opponent. The implications were staggering, both for his reputation and for his understanding of who Sarah Martinez really was. Sir, Staff Sergeant Williams said quietly, I think it's time we had a conversation with MS Martinez about her actual background. As the Marines began making their way out of the training building, Marcus could see the questions in their eyes. Corporal Jenkins in particular looked shaken by the experience. These were combat veterans who had faced enemy fighters in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they'd just been outclassed by someone they'd assumed was a civilian contractor with no real military experience. Marcus made his way down to the training floor, where Sarah was conducting a brief after-action review with his Marines. Her tone was gentle, but professional as she pointed out tactical errors and suggested improvements speaking with the authority of someone who clearly understood urban warfare at an expert level. "Corporal Jenkins," Sarah was saying, "your entry techniques were excellent, but you allowed yourself to be channeled into predetermined routes. In a real combat situation, that predictability would be exploited by experienced opponents." "Ma'am," Jenkins replied, his voice respectful but puzzled, "your tactics were unlike anything we've encountered before. Where exactly did you learn those techniques?" Sarah looked up as Marcus approached, and for the first time since their initial meeting, he saw something different in her eyes. The mild-mannered consultant was gone, replaced by someone whose gaze carried the weight of experiences Marcus was only beginning to understand. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Sarah said calmly, "I believe you wanted to discuss qualifications for combat training." Marcus felt the eyes of his Marines on him as he struggled to find words. The exercise had revealed that his assumptions about Sarah were not just wrong, but dangerously naive. Someone with her level of tactical expertise didn't learn those skills from books or lectures. "Ma'am," Marcus said slowly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about your background. No civilian contractor fights like what we just witnessed." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right, Staff Sergeant. No civilian contractor would have those skills." She paused, studying Marcus's face. "The question is, what made you assume I was just a civilian contractor?" The simple question hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. He realized that he'd never actually asked about Sarah's military background. He'd made assumptions based on her age, her gender, and her civilian clothes, then built an entire narrative around those assumptions without ever seeking verification. Marcus began, then stopped. There was no good answer to her question that didn't reveal the prejudices that had driven his behavior. Corporal Jenkins, still processing what had happened during the exercise, stepped forward tentatively. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what is your actual background?" Sarah looked around at the assembled Marines, then back at Marcus. "Master Chief Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs, retired. 25 years of active service, including multiple combat deployments in every major theater since 2001. The words hit the group like physical blows. Master Chief was the highest enlisted rank in the Navy, equivalent to a sergeant major in the Marines. But more importantly, 25 years in the SEALs meant Sarah had been fighting in special operations before most of Marcus's Marines had even enlisted. "Sal?" Private Washington asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, you're saying you're a Navy SEAL?" Sarah corrected. "I retired 6 months ago. The Navy asked me to return to help implement and improve close-quarters combat training program." She looked directly at Marcus. "The same training program you were so concerned about this morning." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything about the day's events suddenly made sense in a way that left him feeling sick to his stomach. He'd challenged one of the most elite warriors in the American military based on assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. "Master Chief," Staff Sergeant Williams said, stepping forward with obvious respect, "we owe you an apology. This entire situation got out of hand because of misunderstandings about your background." "Did it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Or did it get out of hand because assumptions were made about my qualifications based on factors that have nothing to do with military expertise?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus knew exactly what Sarah was referring to, and the realization was more painful than any physical wound he'd ever received. He dismissed her because she was a woman, because she was older, because she didn't fit his mental image of what a warrior should look like. "Master Chief Martinez," Marcus said, his voice hoarse with shame, "I need to formally apologize for my conduct today. I made assumptions that were completely inappropriate and unprofessional." Sarah studied his face for a long moment before responding. "Staff Sergeant, do you know why I didn't immediately identify myself when you questioned my qualifications?" Marcus shook his head, dreading the answer. "Because I wanted to see if you'd give me the respect due to a fellow service member based on how I conducted myself, not based on rank or credentials." Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I've spent 25 years proving that I belonged in the SEALs. I hope that by now, we'd moved past the point where female service members had to wear their achievements like armor just to be taken seriously." The shame hit Marcus like a physical blow. He not only dismissed Sarah's expertise, he'd done it in front of his Marines in a way that demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that kept qualified people from being judged on their merits. Corporal Jenkins cleared his throat tentatively. "Master Chief, what you did in there, that was some of the most advanced tactical work we've ever seen. How did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. 25 years of training with the best warriors in the world, Corporal. Combat deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, and a dozen other places that don't appear on official records. Operations where the difference between success and failure was often mental flexibility, not just physical strength. She turned back to Marcus. "The training program I've been brought in to implement focuses on exactly what you saw today: adaptive thinking, unconventional tactics, and the ability to overcome opponents who might have advantages in numbers or firepower." Marcus realized that the training Sarah offered was exactly what his Marines needed to face the evolving threats they'd encounter in future deployments. The enemy forces he'd faced in Afghanistan had been increasingly sophisticated and adaptive, while American units sometimes struggled to move beyond established procedures. "Master Chief," Marcus said formally, "I request permission to have my Marines participate in your training program." "Granted, Staff Sergeant. But first, we need to address what happened here today." Sarah looked around at the assembled Marines. This wasn't just about military tactics. It was about the assumptions we make about each other and how those assumptions can blind us to reality. Private Washington raised his hand tentatively. "Master Chief, how do we prevent this kind of mistake in the future?" Sarah smiled for the first time since Marcus had met her. "You ask questions instead of making assumptions. You judge people based on their actions and capabilities, not on what you think they should look like. And you remember that in the military, we're all on the same team." As the Marines began to disperse, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah. The weight of what had happened was beginning to settle on him, and he knew that his conduct would have consequences that extended far beyond this single training exercise. "Master Chief," he said quietly, "I know an apology isn't enough. My behavior today was inexcusable." Sarah studied him carefully. "Staff Sergeant, we all have biases and assumptions. The question is what we do when those assumptions are challenged. Are you willing to learn from this experience?" Marcus nodded, though he knew that rebuilding his credibility would take time and consistent action. "Yes, Master Chief, I am." "Good," Sarah replied, "because your Marines deserve leaders who see them clearly, just as they deserve to be seen clearly themselves. And that means all of them, regardless of gender, race, or any other factor that has nothing to do with their ability to do the job." As Marcus walked back toward the barracks to begin the difficult process of explaining the day's events to his commanding officer, he carried with him the knowledge that he'd been given a gift disguised as humiliation. Sarah Martinez had shown him not just his weaknesses, but a path toward becoming a better leader and a better Marine. The lesson was far from over. 3 weeks after the training exercise that had fundamentally changed his perspective, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood in the same observation room where his assumptions had been so thoroughly dismantled. But this time, he was watching his Marines execute advanced tactics under the guidance of Master Chief Sarah Martinez, and the transformation in their capabilities was remarkable. The new training program that Sarah had implemented went far beyond traditional military instruction. She'd introduced concepts of adaptive thinking, unconventional problem-solving, and tactical flexibility that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about combat preparation. More importantly, she'd created an environment where Marines were encouraged to question established procedures and develop innovative solutions to complex problems. "Watch how Corporal Jenkins approaches this scenario," Sarah said as she stood beside Marcus at the observation window. 3 weeks ago, he would have followed standard procedure and walked into the same trap that eliminated his team. Now he's thinking like his opponent, anticipating moves instead of just reacting to them. Marcus nodded, genuinely impressed by what he was seeing. Jenkins was leading a team through an urban warfare scenario that would have been impossible for them to complete using conventional tactics. But armed with Sarah's training in adaptive thinking and unconventional approaches, they were successfully neutralizing threats that had previously seemed insurmountable. The past 3 weeks have been the most challenging and educational period of Marcus's military career. After the initial shock of learning Sarah's true identity had worn off, he'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own leadership style and the limitations it placed on his Marines' development. The first lesson had come during a private conversation with his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had heard about the training exercise through official channels. Marcus had expected disciplinary action, but instead found himself in a discussion about unconscious bias and its impact on military effectiveness. "Thompson," the colonel had said, "what happened with Master Chief Martinez wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a tactical failure that could have had serious consequences in a real combat situation. If you can't accurately assess the capabilities of friendly forces, how can we trust your assessment of enemy capabilities?" The question had hit home harder than any formal reprimand. Marcus realized that his assumptions about Sarah had blinded him to obvious signs of her expertise, and if he could make such fundamental errors in a controlled training environment, what mistakes might he make in actual combat? The second lesson had come from his Marines themselves. In the days following the exercise, several of them had approached him privately to discuss what had happened. Their conversations revealed that Marcus's dismissive attitude towards Sarah had influenced their own perceptions and prevented them from recognizing the value of her insights. Sergeant Corporal Jenkins had said during one of these conversations, "When you questioned the Master Chief qualifications, we just assumed you knew something we didn't. We stopped thinking critically about the situation and started following your lead. But that led us all to underestimate someone who could have taught us important lessons from day one." The third and most important lesson had come from Sarah herself. Rather than using the situation to humiliate Marcus or damage his career, she'd approached him with an offer to help him develop better leadership skills. Her willingness to turn a painful experience into a learning opportunity had demonstrated the kind of professional maturity that Marcus aspired to achieve. "The goal isn't to make you feel bad about what happened," Sarah had explained during their first one-on-one training session. "The goal is to make you a better leader who can maximize the potential of everyone under your command. That means learning to see people clearly, without the filter of assumptions and preconceptions." Now, 3 weeks later, Marcus was beginning to understand what Sarah meant. As he watched his Marines execute complex scenarios with newfound confidence and creativity, he could see that they'd been capable of this level of performance all along. What had been missing wasn't ability, but the kind of training that challenged them to think beyond established procedures. "Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, interrupting his thoughts, "what differences do you see in your Marines' performance compared to 3 weeks ago?" Marcus considered the question carefully. They're more flexible in their thinking. They're not just following procedures anymore. They're adapting those procedures based on the specific situation they're facing. And they're more confident in their ability to handle unexpected challenges. "Good observation," Sarah replied. "But there's something else, something that might be even more important." Marcus looked at her questioningly. "They're working better as a team," Sarah continued. "When you stop treating their diversity as a limitation and started treating it as a resource, they began leveraging their different perspectives and experiences more effectively." It was true. Marcus had noticed that his Marines were communicating more openly during training exercises, sharing insights and suggestions in ways they hadn't before. The change in his own attitude seemed to have given them permission to contribute more fully to the team's success. The transformation hadn't been limited to his Marines, either. Marcus had begun to examine his own assumptions about leadership and military effectiveness. He'd started reading about cognitive bias and its impact on decision-making, attending workshops on inclusive leadership, and seeking feedback from his subordinates in ways he'd never considered before. The most significant change had come in his approach to evaluating personnel. Instead of relying on surface-level impressions and traditional markers of military bearing, Marcus had begun to focus on actual performance and potential. The results had been eye-opening. Lance Corporal Martinez, again, no relation, a quiet Marine who had never stood out in Marcus's previous assessments, had revealed exceptional analytical abilities when given the opportunity to contribute to tactical planning. Private Chun, whose slight build had led Marcus to question her suitability for infantry work, had demonstrated innovative problem-solving skills that made her invaluable in complex scenarios. Master Chief, Marcus said as they watched his Marines complete another successful training evolution, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. What's that, Staff Sergeant? How many other qualified people have I overlooked because they didn't match what I thought a Marine should look like? How many opportunities have my Marines missed because I was too focused on conformity instead of capability? Sarah turned to look at him directly. That's a question only you can answer, but I'm glad you're asking it. Recognition of the problem is the first step towards solving it. The conversation was interrupted by Corporal Jenkins approaching the observation window. His team had just completed a particularly challenging scenario, and his expression showed both exhaustion and satisfaction. Sergeant, Master Chief, Jenkins said, that was the most complex training exercise we've ever completed successfully. The techniques Master Chief Martinez has taught us have completely changed how we approach problems. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his Marines' accomplishment, but it was tempered by the recognition that their potential had always been there, waiting to be properly developed. Outstanding work, Corporal. What did you learn from the exercise? That there's always more than one way to solve a problem, Jenkins replied. The key is being open to solutions that might not be obvious at first, and that the best ideas sometimes come from unexpected sources. It was a lesson that extended far beyond military tactics, and Marcus knew that Jenkins understood the broader implications of what he was saying. As the training session concluded and the Marines began preparing their equipment for the next evolution, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah once again. The relationship between them had evolved from antagonistic to respectful to genuinely collaborative, and he'd come to value her insights on leadership as much as her tactical expertise. Master Chief, Marcus said, I know my behavior 3 weeks ago was inexcusable, but I want you to know how grateful I am for the way you've handled the situation. You could have destroyed my career, but instead you've helped me become a better leader. Sarah smiled, and Marcus could see genuine warmth in her expression. Staff Sergeant, the military is stronger when we help each other grow instead of tearing each other down. Your willingness to learn from a difficult experience says more about your character than the mistake you made in the first place. Still, Marcus persisted, I need you to know that I understand the broader implications of what happened. It wasn't just about you or me. It was about the assumptions and biases that prevent the military from maximizing the talents of all service members. That's exactly right, Sarah agreed. And that understanding makes you part of the solution instead of part of the problem. As they prepared to leave the training facility, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a confident Marine staff sergeant who thought he understood leadership and military effectiveness. Today, he was a wiser leader who recognized that true strength came from embracing diversity of thought and experience rather than enforcing conformity. The lesson had been painful, but it had also been transformative. Marcus knew that he would carry the insights he'd gained from Sarah Martinez throughout the rest of his military career and beyond. More importantly, he would pass those lessons on to the Marines under his command, helping to create a culture where every service member was judged on their merit rather than on assumptions about what a warrior should look like. As they walked across the base in the Hawaiian sunset, Marcus couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if he'd approached that first meeting with Sarah with curiosity instead of prejudgment. The missed opportunities and wasted potential could have been avoided if he'd simply taken the time to see her clearly from the beginning. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to change, never too late to grow, and never too late to become the leader that your people deserve. The woman walking beside him had spent 25 years proving that assumptions about capability could be dangerously wrong. Now, it was his turn to ensure that future generations of Marines would benefit from that hard-won wisdom. In the distance, a new group of Marines was arriving for the next training cycle, and Marcus found himself wondering what hidden talents and untapped potential they possessed. This time, he would be ready to see them clearly from day one. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.